It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Pulliam. Heather Pulliam is Professor of History of Art at the University of Edinburgh, and she works principally on what we call insular art and Irish art. What in England we would call the Anglo-Saxon, although that's a contested term. But Heather wrote a PhD thesis and subsequently did a wonderful book on the Book of Kells. And she's done many things since. She did a great big fat art bulletin article a few years ago on the Irish High Crosses. And she's done plenty more besides. She was a speaker at the Newcastle conference back in 2010 or 2011, spoke on Lindisfarne Gospels and is published on Lindisfarne subsequently. And you won't thank me for this, one publication I have to read out, a recent one, Rethinking Slow Looking, Encounters with Clonmacnoise, in a book called Slow Scholarship, Medieval Research in the Neoliberal University. The Neoliberal University. I don't know what the Neoliberal University is, but perhaps we'll find out. Anyway, you're not going to speak on that tonight. You can see the title of tonight's lecture, Hellmouths, Human Remains and Holy Ground, Death, Resurrection, and Insular Monuments. So Heather, welcome. And Heather's got a book project at the moment, which is, just about done, and she's better qualified to speak about that than I am. So thank you, Heather, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It's a huge pleasure and an honor, really. I should say today's talk is a lot. It is a chapter from this forthcoming book, which is called Art and the Living Frame, which I hope to God will be out, or at least to the publisher in a few months, where I'm trying to sort of think about how we frame insular monuments. Where do they end and where do they begin? So that's part of what today's paper will be looking at, is thinking about how the ground could be considered part of the art object. So it is a very art historical paper. It's also, I'm trying to show you a lot of examples. So instead of slow looking in the neoliberal university, we will be quick looking in the Society of Antiquaries building, which is probably a very different thing. So just to begin, I'll start with manuscripts, which is where I began. Within manuscript studies, Herbert Broderick first delineated the significance and animated nature of insular frames as embodied, animated, and meaningful. To this group, I would like to add the 11th century Harley Psalter due to its relevance to my topic today. Its 8th century model, the famed Utrecht Psalter, portrays Hades and the damned ensconced in a hell pit at the lower right corner of the page. The Harley artists add a frame to the image and pushes the depiction of Hades and hell into that frame. Nonetheless, from this liminal space, hell manages to infiltrate the page, the space of the main image. While 3 sides of the frame maintain a double border, the right side is demarcated by a single line. It becomes porous. It's as if a sinkhole is opened up, breaking into the fabric of the page. In contrast, the frame on the recto of the same page has identical proportions and size, but maintains its double edge without any violation or interruption. My paper today consists of another kind of frame, specifically the earth in which monumental crosses and cross slabs stood. Art historical analyses tend to overlook the ground, with a few notable exceptions. Lucy Donkin's Standing on Holy Ground in the Middle Ages, published in 2022, offers what has been described as a paradigm shift by drawing the reader's gaze downwards. But even this important work tends to favor surface, pavement, textile coverings, floor decoration, layers over depths. Within an insular context, Jane Hawkes and then Colleen Thomas have explored how vine scroll imagery, on monumental crosses evokes the tree of life emerging from the ground. Critically, Hawkes observes that while we may not be able to pinpoint the original setting of most crosses, quote, in order to stand as monuments dominating the landscape in their original form, the high crosses had of necessity to be placed in the earth. Most relevant to my own approach, Maggie McEnroe Williams and Victoria Thompson Whitworth have noted instances in which human remains interred beneath and around specific monuments were integral to their iconographic meaning. These publications, however, stand out amongst the hundreds of others that simply ignore the ground, treating it as an invisible canvas, two-dimensional, insubstantial, inactive, and without significance. The tendency is a methodological blind spot that is reinforced by the relative absence of ground in illustrations and display, where it is either excised, signaled in an abbreviated form, or replaced. Early medieval artists and audiences, however, did not, I would argue, see the ground as mere background in the modern sense, but rather as a significant gateway full of comings and goings. This paper pivots traditional perspectives to consider the role of the ground not just as a surface, but as a portal to what lies beneath. It does so, however, via traditional art historical methods, offering new interpretations of iconographic types prevalent in early medieval art. And in this evening's paper, I'm going to use those types, specifically the 4 that you see listed here, as a way of structuring the paper. So you'll know we're near the end when we get to the monsters. So hold out hope for the monsters. Thrown in a pit and sealed with a stone, yet emerging unscathed, Daniel prefigured Christ's own imprisonment, entombment, and resurrection. While I will focus on Iona, I'll also briefly cover 4 additional examples at Kells in County Meath, Castledermot in County Kildare, Drumcliff in County Sligo, and Keels in southwestern Scotland. To begin with, however, I have to break my own rule, and we need to begin by looking up, specifically at St. Martin's Cross, which stands at the eastern edge of Iona, facing the Sound of Mull. Evidence suggests that it stands in its original position and is among the first of the monumental crosses to be circumscribed with a stone ring. Carved at its crossing is a medallion with the Virgin and Child and 4 angels. Despite the limited space, the upper angels managed to stretch their disproportionately large interior wings over the Virgin and Child. Thomas Clancy first observed in passing that this arrangement of the wings recalled the cherubim and the Ark of the Covenant. As has thoroughly been demonstrated in the work of Jennifer O'Reilly and Carol Farr, Insular artists and writers frequently conflated the Ark, temple, and tabernacle to the point that they become almost interchangeable. The association between the Virgin and Child and the Ark, temple, and tabernacle is set out in the commentaries and Advent hymns that drew from Psalms 17 and 18, and I think this is essential to understanding the iconography of St. Martin's Cross and also its setting. The latter describes the tabernacle within the context of marriage. He has set his tabernacle in the sun, and he, as a bridegroom, coming out of his bride chamber, has rejoiced as a giant to run the way. Exegetical texts and liturgical hymns interpreted the bridegroom as Christ and the tabernacle in the sun as his mother's womb. At Iona, the sun rises in the east behind this image, surrounding and permeating the gaps of the crux and the ring. God's tabernacle is literally set within the sun. While the emergence of the bridegroom from the tabernacle was glossed as Christ's birth from Mary, the following verses of the psalm, his going is out from the end of heaven, and his circuit even to the end thereof, and there is no one that can hide himself from his heat, was seen as referring to Christ's descent through his death on the cross down into the depths of hell, the end of heaven. Interpretations of the psalm explain that Christ, as a giant like Daniel, breaks open hell's gates, returning to heaven and bringing the faithful out of hell and death with him. And I think this Tiberius image nicely captures possibly the psalm itself, with Christ as a giant bending down. Exegetes saw this interpretation as prefaced in the verses of the preceding psalm. The sorrows of death surrounded me, the sorrows of hell encompassed me, and he heard my voice from his holy temple. He bowed down the heavens and descended, and he ascended upon the cherubim, and he made darkness his covert, his tabernacle round about him. Dark waters in the clouds of the air, and he brought me forth into a large place. He saved me. Directly beneath the Virgin and Child is a large standing figure flanked by two lions. The image represents Daniel in the lion's den. For medieval Christians, Psalm 17 and 18 describe Christ as a bridegroom and a giant, emerging and descending with his tabernacle to rescue humankind from the sorrows of hell and the snares of death. Equally, however, the Psalm's reference to "no one can hide from his heat" was glossed as Christ's return in glory to judge. On St. Martin's cross, Christ, as embodied or prefigured by Daniel, is a literal giant, larger than the Virgin and at least twice the size of all other figures, including the figure that Jane Hawkes has identified as Goliath at the very, very bottom on the far left of the cross. Excavation reports from Iona indicate that the area surrounding the crosses was filled with human burials from the earliest period onwards. Consequently, St. Martin's Cross plunged into a ground filled with the monastery's dead, awaiting resurrection. In at least 4 other examples scattered across Ireland and Western Scotland, Daniel and the lions occurs in the same position of the cross, at the juncture between the cross ring and the shaft. While the similarity between Iona and Kells might be understood via the close relationship between monasteries, its broader spread suggests that it likely reflected an understanding of Christ's descent from the heavens to the earth via the cross, as prefigured by Daniel, but also hinting at his return or circuit back into the heavens. As with the temptation page in the Book of Kells, which I have here, and more widely in exegesis, Christ's head is represented as is indicative of his divinity, while his body signifies his union with the earthly church. And I think this is what's going on and why we continually see his head in the ring and his body in the shaft. And I'm speaking of Daniel as Christ, as a kind of conflated image. So the second type that I would like to look at today is Christ in the tomb, of which there are 4, one at Clonmacnoise, one at Kells, Durrow, and Monasterboice. Despite the geographical scatter, Roger Staley has identified all 4 as the work of the so-called Murdoch master. In each case, Christ in the tomb is positioned at the very bottom of the cross shaft. Noting the consistency of the panel's position close to the ground, Peter Harbison suggested that the image evoked the Harrowing of Hell, quoting Blathmack's old Irish poem, "He who suffered on the cross, who was buried beneath cold stone, and who went after that on a visit to hell. He was victorious from fighting that, his great battle with the devil." Christ's wrapped and entombed body conveys passive stillness. The setting of Christ's battle is invisible and yet tangible in the form of the earth upon which the cross's audiences and the crosses stood, and in which some of its audience might have hoped to have been buried. Literary sources emphasize the role of monastic foundations as places of burial and resurrection, and more broadly, portraying the monasteries of powerful saints as gateways to heaven for their communities and the dead who were buried there. When St. Kieran of Syre, not to be confused with St. Kieran, abbot of Clonmacnoise, neared death, he prayed that the gates of hell would not be closed upon whoever should be buried in his monastery. More specific to the monumental crosses, St. Mahuda prophesied that he would return to lead his monks, living and dead, to gather before the monastery's cross on the day of judgment. All 4 crosses are located within monasteries that had relics of their founder saints: Columba at Durrow and Kells, Kieran at Clonmacnoise, and Buia at Monasterboice. Iona and Clonmacnoise provide the clearest picture of the original sites of their crosses and their surroundings. So these have been kind of important case studies for me because they're the only ones where we can really be certain where the crosses were originally and have a sense of their built environment. Due to multiple excavations and also just luck of the draw, I think. In both cases, a group of early medieval crosses stood within the inner bounds of the monastery, positioned just to the west of the main church, and the shrines that likely housed the corporeal relics of the founding saints. Human remains dating from the early medieval period were found clustered in the small areas that contain the crosses, church, and founders' relics. The 2 monasteries produced a wealth of recumbent slabs, over 800 from Clonmacnoise, some engraved with the names and others with a cross, or a combination of the 2. It is possible, even likely, given the size, shape, and inscriptions on the recumbent slabs, that they functioned as grave markers for the monastery's elite, including successive abbots. While certainly some areas and burials were demarcated within the monasteries as being holier than others, and from this antiquarian drawing, it does look as if there was an attempt by the elite to really snuggle up to Columba's shrine. The grounds of the monastery seem to have been littered with the dead awaiting resurrection. Bede described Iona as, quote, the island monastery where his, Columba's, body lies, implying that the entire landmass of the island served as a kind of grave for its founder. The cross's audiences would have seen their own dead, wrapped in shrouds, and in the case of elite burials, beneath a recumbent slab, in close proximity to the ground in which these crosses were erected. While contemporary descriptions of the Harrowing of Hell understood the event as occurring while Christ's body lay in the tomb, its final culmination would not occur until Last Judgment. There seems, however, to be no coherent theology as to what would happen to the souls who were freed from hell by Christ during his death, but a number of works claim that they returned to the site of their burial to await final resurrection. The association between the earth, place, and death is reinforced by the many references in medieval Irish to the sod of death, the predestined spot upon which a person died, and that was often associated with the sod of burial. And John Carey has a paper coming out very soon, I think, on this. In 2 of the 4 surviving instances, the complementary or obverse panel, and by that I mean the panel that's positioned in the same position directly opposite of the entombed Christ. So in 2 of the instances, the obverse panel refers explicitly to the resurrection of Christ, to the resurrection and the founder saint. At Clonmacnoise, the lowest eastern panel shows St. Kieran planting the foundation stake of his church, recalling the description from his Vita, and coming to that place, he said, "Here I will live, and many souls shall leave this place to enter the kingdom of God, and this will be the place of my resurrection." At Durrow, the lowest panel on the cross's eastern face shows 2 seated men and another man flanked by angels. The 3 men appear to be tonsured, suggesting that the man flanked by angels is Durrow's monastic founder, the resurrected Columba flanked by angels. Unfortunately, there is no record of the obverse panel at Kells, which was recarved in the early modern period. Whereas the bottom cross shafts of Durrow and Clonmacnoise explicitly delineate the resurrection through their founder saint, that of the tall cross in Monasterboice depends upon Old Testament typology, showing David rescuing his flock from the lion. Which brings me to my 3rd type, David and the lion. Several publications have highlighted the prominence of Davidic imagery in insular art, as well as the consistency with which David is shown prying open the jaws of the lion as opposed to battering it with a club. While the prevalence of the imagery has largely been understood in terms of royal associations and the importance of the Psalms, I would argue that it also signifies the harrowing of hell. In insular depictions, the jaws of the lion become a dramatic focal point of the struggle between David and the lion. The Psalms frequently refer to the jaws of lions opening to roar and seize souls. In the New Testament and exegesis, the lion that seeks to devour is explicitly linked to Satan and hell. The visual emphasis points to the Christological and eschatological interpretations, where David's sheep represents Christ's faithful, the lion's jaws become a hellmouth, threatening damnation, and David prefigures Christ coming to the rescue. The association between the scene and the harrowing of hell is also evident in insular psalters and psalters with insular characteristics, such as the Corby Psalter. And by this, I mean it's where the David and the lion panel occurs within the 150 psalms that they had to choose from. So at Corby, it occurs at Psalm 7, in which the psalmist calls for God to deliver me lest they seize my soul at any time like a lion. Its conclusion, rise up in anger and be exalted, was glossed as indicating Christ's triumph over hell. And I've just chosen a few examples. There's quite a few. I'm just going to speak about two. And then at Psalm 52 in the Vespasian Psalter, in which Christian exegetes saw as prophesying when the saved would be set free from the captivity of death to live in the heavenly kingdom. But we also see evidence of it in the Tiberius Psalter, which Kathleen Openshaw first noted closely echoes the harrowing of hell later in the cycle, pointing to the distinctive leonine shape of the hellmouth and Christ's stooped pose in both images. At Duro, the image occurs in the crosshead on what is presumed to have been the east side of the cross. Christ stands on the center of the face, flanked by angels, wearing a long robe and holding a cross and budding rod. These attributes and position are relatively standard in insular depictions of the resurrected and glorified Christ, typically within images of Last Judgment. At Duro, the David and lion occupies the position usually reserved for demons and the damned, and so is wholly appropriate to the image's association with the harrowing of hell. At Kells, images of David and the lion appear twice, once on the cross of St. Patrick and Columba, and once on the market cross. On the former, David appears to carry, I hope this is visible, David appears to carry a long cross on his shoulder. The pose recalls the triumphant Christ treading upon the beasts of Psalm 90, which was prevalent in the late antique insular and Carolingian cultures. In these images, the manner in which the cross is carried on the shoulder denotes the triumph, but also the harrowing of hell, specifically Isaiah 22:22. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and no one shall shut. He shall shut, and no one shall open. This one is going to be really difficult to see, but I figure if any group can do it, you guys are it. So here we go. On the market cross, the lion's tail loops under its leg and up over its hindquarters. Its end transforms into a serpent whose jaws enclose the head of a tiny human figure who's crouching in the lower right. This is him here. It does sound like the Eye of Faith, but if you see enough of the works of the so-called Murdoch master, this little tiny, frightened, crouching figure appears quite a lot, so it helps you sort of discern him. Because in both scenes, David and the lion are at the lateral arms, at the end of the lateral arms of the cross, and the lion's heads are pulled up and back, their mouths are open to the heavens. much in the way that Christ's entombed body points the audience towards death within the earth at their feet. The lion's empty and open mouth directs audiences to contemplate the released soul's journey to the skies above Kells. Something closer to home for me. Well, perhaps the best known Pictish depiction of David occurs at St. Andrews. Today I will be focusing on the Dublin Cross and Aberlemno 3, so these are my Pictish examples. In both instances, the scene appears at the very bottom, just above the ground, on the reverse of the cross slab. The Dublin Cross is one of the better-known Pictish monuments due to the presence of an inscription on its reverse, which Catherine Forsyth first identified as reading Constantine, son of Fergus. Constantine was king of the Picts from 790 and the Scottish Dalriada from 811. The inscription somewhat undermined the previous stylistic dating, which had indicated that the monument might be at least a generation later. Reframing this monument within the context of the broader findings that I've set out so far, I think we might actually be able to resolve this conflict, or a seeming conflict, between inscription and style. The front of the Dublin Cross is dominated by a large vine scroll, or possibly two vine scrolls that intertwine with one another, as there seem to be two bases, and hopefully you guys can make that out, these two separate bases of the vine. The vine scroll is unusual, first because it rarely occurs on Pictish sculpture, and second because of its size and prominence. It's really robust. Directly beneath the vine scroll is a mounted rider. Because of his prominence and the fact that he mirrors the exact position as the inscription on the reverse, the rider is usually taken to be a representation of the king, with his armed followers standing beneath him. Another striking feature is the monument's socket stone, which extends forward to create a platform, prompting suggestions of ritual use as a place to kneel before the cross. The reverse of the cross is primarily filled with abstract ornament, except in the lowest panel, which portrays David and the lion. David is naked and pries open the lion's jaws. Behind the lion, I'm walking, so this is David, here's the lion. Then behind the lion is another quadruped that has been identified, as a sheep or hunting dog. I'm not sure which. It looks more like a hunting dog, but it's very odd not to have any sheep in the image. David stands on the back of a wild boar with a short tail, long snout, and protruding fangs. Just down here. To the left of the boar is a large bear impaled on a spear. While both lion and bear feature in the description from the Bible, the boar's presence is unusual and unaccounted for. And yet it is quite prominent and seems to be digging down into the corner of the frame with its snout and hoof. While pigs and swine appear plenty in the Bible, primarily as signs or vessels of impurity, the wild boar appears only once in Psalm 79. The psalm begins comparing God's leadership to that of a shepherd minding his flock. It then turns to what Cassiodorus identifies as the central motif, the vineyard. The psalmist credits God with bringing the vineyard out of Egypt and replanting it in a new place. This is followed by several verses praising the vineyard. However, suddenly in verse 13, the psalmist begins to question God as to why he has exposed the vineyard to predators, quote, so that all they who pass by the way do pluck at it, end quote. He goes on to complain, quote, the boar out of the wood has laid it to waste, a single wild beast has devoured it. The psalmist then begs God to return and punish those who prey upon the vine, claiming things set on fire and dug down shall perish at the rebuke of thy countenance. On Duplin, the boar's position as the lowest creature on the reverse of the cross shaft and the manner in which it digs down into the ground with its snout and hoof recalls the psalm's reference to those who have dug down and will be censured by God. Exegetical commentaries gloss this verse as referring to the wicked who fall into the pits of their own making. The manner in which David steps on the back of the pig, or boar, I should say, equally suggests the eventual triumph of God and the godly, as promised by the Psalms, when their enemies of God shall become his footstool. As readily apparent for both Psalm 79 and the Duplin Cross, the vine and the vineyard play a central role. The Psalm's emphasis upon replanting the vineyard might explain the somewhat unique twin plinths and twin vines that fill and intertwine through the crosshead. The conceptualization of a transplanted and yet unified vineyard also fits within the role that Constantine played in unifying Dalriada in the west and the Picts in the east. It could even have a resonance with the translation of Columba's relics from Iona to nearby Dunkeld, which some have suggested Constantine might have initiated. Isabel Henderson argued that the monument's combination of a freestanding monumental cross, more typical of Western Scotland and Ireland, with Pictish stylistic features, might have similarly represented Constantine's socio-political maneuvers towards unification of East and West. The monument's position in central Scotland, next to a royal centre of Forteviot and along a major routeway from the Dalriada in the west and Pickland in the east, has been seen in the same terms. Appropriate to the inscribed commemoration of the images of the mounted armed ruler and his loyal followers, Augustine interpreted Psalm 79 as confessing, quote, both Christ and the vineyard, that is, the head and the body, the king and the people. Psalm 79 describes the transplanted vineyard in depth, filling the land, the shadow of it covered by the hills. It stretched forth its branches unto the sea, and its boughs unto the river. The metaphorical language of the psalm and its interpretation interweaves the cross's imagery with both its historical context and the lands that once surrounded it. Before the cross was removed indoors in the 1990s, it was situated on a hill overlooking the River Erne, which is presently obscured by a thick pine forest, which seems to have been its original location, although that's tenuous. But saying that it is, the River Erne merges into the Tay, the longest river in Scotland that stretches from Ben Louis in the Western Highlands to the Firth of Tay in the east, where it spills into the sea. Consequently, the vines that fill the arms of the cross might easily be envisioned as closely following the description of the psalm, filling the land, its shadow covering the hills, stretching forth its branches to the sea, and its boughs to the rivers. The cross, Constantine's kingship, and Perthshire become the metaphysical center rooted in the ground and faith that united Constantine's people and God's church. The David panels of both the Duplin Cross and the Tall Cross are located on what is believed to have been their east sides, associated with resurrection and the rising sun. All of this may suggest that the Duplin inscription is commemorative, so not made by Constantine himself, but by his successors, looking towards a resurrection of the royal line of Pictish kings and their people. Again, it would be well suited to a verse from Psalm 79, and we depart not from thee, thou shalt quicken us. Like Duplin and several other monuments discussed so far, the Aberlimno stone seems to employ the bottom areas of both sides of the cross slab for complementary narratives. On its reverse, it depicts David and the lion invoking the Harrowing of Hell, which hopefully you can just see at the bottom. On its front side, it depicts a large ornate cross. On the lower right side, a quadruped attacks a prone human figure who seems to be falling or dragged down to the ground. The monument's supporting socket stone is undecorated and currently beneath the ground, which some have suggested may be its original position. Consequently, anyone looking at the scene is forced to stoop down to properly view the prone human figure descending into the crack between the supporting socket stone, ground, and monument. And you really do. This is, of all the crosses that I've looked at in cross slabs, this is the one where you really do have to bend down quite low or kneel down and crouch in order to see the figures. The effect has an uncanny sense, as the figures seem to be falling through the cracks and into the ground upon which the audience would have stood. And the fact that it's positioned by the edge of a motorway also makes it very frightening. Okay, so monsters on the edge. Pictish monsters frequently play upon this interface between ground and cross, representation and reality, which brings me to my final category, monsters. Perhaps the most disturbing example is Meagle 23. Its side depicts two large quadrupeds pawing at the ground. The beast to the furthest left has managed to extricate a human leg from the earth. So I don't know if you can just see it. He's pulling it up out of the earth. This is the leg. Carved on a recumbent gravestone that would have covered the body buried beneath, so it's body size, it reminds its audience of the permeability of the ground and the fragility of human remains. Monstrous creatures frequently prowl and slither along the edges of Pictish works. There are countless examples. And Isabel Henderson's Pictish Monsters remains sort of if you haven't read it, it's a tiny little pamphlet, but it's just one of her most amazing pieces of scholarship where she looks at Pictish monsters. But she's delineated quite a few of these. But what she hasn't noticed or talked about is their positioning, I think. On the reverse of the cross slab at Phallus Wester, a large quadruped walks along the lowermost portion of the monument, its jaws wrapped around its human victim. At Elgin, the wide base of an inscribed cross manages to keep the creatures firmly in check. So this is the inscribed cross, and then it has its own very, very wide base. However, it acts as a reassuring, substantial barrier between the creatures and the human figures represented in the upper portion. Nonetheless, the thick base also serves as a tangible reminder of the actual base in which the cross slab was positioned, drawing attention to the ground upon which the monument's audience stood. While the salvific power of the cross and its ministers is signaled, the threat of hell and its creatures is nonetheless tangible. On the papal stone, the monks who walk towards the central compass cross, so this cross, as well as the lion, are neatly arranged on their registers. Their feet and paws rest on even horizontal ground. In contrast, the demonic birdmen and their prey seem to drift aslant across the stone. There is no ground beneath them, or rather there is ground and they are under it. Although there is a sense that they are being kept at bay by the many registers and ground lines above them, the lack of frame gives them a greater freedom of movement and a direct relationship with the stone itself. This effect is heightened by the fact that the lower part of the stone is less immaculately dressed, its surface more undulating and uneven. From a cultural and stylistic perspective, the lack of frame and even uneven surface might consciously evoke the Pictish pre-Christian tradition of carving on undressed stones. From an art historical and psychological perspective, the absence of frame and ground causes a disjuncture between the imagined portrayed space and that of the physical, tangible present. Once again, ground is no mere background. The most disturbing aspects of the demonic forces is that they seem to occupy our space, our ground, our material reality. Which brings me to my last section, which is to kind of look at broader conclusions that we might think about. Exegetes understood the breadth, length, height, and depth of Christ's love from Ephesians 3 as embodied in the cosmological cross, extending infinitely outwards in all directions. Beatrice Kitzinger has suggested that the frequent delineation and inclusion of the tang, so this lower stub, on medieval crosses, as well as representations of Adam's burial at Golgotha, drew upon the conceptualization of the cross, where depth was associated with the hidden mysteries of God. Additionally, I would argue that we need to consider the dynamic and dramatic role frequently played by the bottom of the cross shaft as a site of resurrection and rescue. Continental examples include Psalm 23 of the Stuttgart Psalter, where Christ uses the very bottom of his cross shaft to break open the bolts of hell's gates. Or the many, many depictions in the Utrecht Psalter where Christ's cross is surrounded by coffins from which the dead emerge, or where Christ plunges his cross into the earth, using it to lever up the dead from the pit. Or the many images from the 10th and 11th centuries where Adam and Eve cling to the bottom of the cross shaft as Christ pulls them up from the Hellmouth, including this Carolingian ivory, as well as yet another example where you have the coffins of the dead at the bottom of the cross. And rather interesting in terms of what we're talking about today, the crosses and the figures surrounding it are sort of very horizontal, but the coffins are tipped into the viewer's space. So they're sort of operating somewhere between the plane of the image and our space. They were literally wedged in that frame. So, in conclusion, Insular artists, I think, had the same preoccupation with the depths of the cross, but their focus seems to have been upon it as a mechanism for salvation and resurrection, with explicit reference to Christ's descent to break open the gates of death and hell. The shaft of the cross penetrates into ground, but it's not represented ground, it's actual ground, which was filled not with depictions of dead bodies, but actual bodies, and acts as a weapon that breaks open the gates and as a key that frees the damned and the dead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Heather. There's lots to think about there and lots to talk about. It's very difficult. I know you know this, and everybody here knows this too. It's very difficult to come up with, I mean, these objects have had a lot of scrutiny, you know. It's very difficult to come up with such a large amount of new thought and persuasive new thought about these things. So, yeah, I'm impressed. Yeah. So I wonder if we've got questions, people. There's a roving microphone which the director of the British Archaeological Association is going to carry around. Will people ask questions? I'm going to ask a chair's question just to begin with, and so I don't need the roving microphone. That is this, that in some ways this consideration of these objects in their landscape context like this, both the near context of the churchyard and also, you know, you showed us the one with the River Erne in the background, you know. It reminds me a little bit of the sort of near obsession that there was in the 1990s with integration in architecture later period, artistic integration, this idea that, you know, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that we have to take into account, if we want a proper, you know, as full as possible, a sort of grasp of how people historically appreciated these things, we have to take into account what the setting was like, you know. And I wonder if in the antiquarian scholarship on these crosses, if there's any consideration given to the settings of them. Because certainly with reference to this later stuff, this Gothic architecture stuff, in the 19th century they were super into that, you know. They were really into this idea of integration. And then it dropped out. Formalism took hold and it dropped out. And then it came back in the 90s. I just wondered if the antiquaries talk about this sort of stuff. Do they talk about the landscape and that sort of stuff?
I think I think they talk a bit about the landscape, and they certainly are drawing it. What's happened really, especially with the study of the Irish crosses, was that it was Romanticism really took hold in terms of representations of them. And when everyone else was becoming very scientific, especially the Romanesque, and in trying to be scientific with art history, Kingsley Porter, who was so good on the Romanesque in Europe and so, very objective and analytic, he went mad when he went to Ireland. He has these talks about fairies, and I think there's really been attempts by people to try to rescue Ireland from that kind of romantic representation. But I think the pendulum has swung the other way, so that we've become too clinical and objective, and that we do, and it does risk speculation, because other than Iona and Clonmacnoise, we really don't have any firm context. So other than, as Jane Hawkes says, the sky was above and the earth was beneath. Unless you think some of these were inside, but I think it would be hard to argue that for a lot of them.
Any medievalist risks speculation. In fact, any medievalist speculates all the time. Come on, we must have some questions, people. Let's have our hands up here. Richard Plant down the back.
I feel I'm keeping out a more interesting and intelligent question. Thank you, Heather. That was amazing. That was really interesting, and I look forward to the book. How were they used in the performance of liturgy? What sort of ceremonies or whatever did they prompt? That would be my question.
Yeah, I think increasingly people have argued, I think, persuasively against the idea of any kind of outdoor mass or which had been suggested. But I do think, if nothing else, certainly with Clonmacnoise, this cross goes up when that church, although the wall that you're looking at was rebuilt, but the church was right there, so not much has been changed because the lower course is still there. So we know that they built a stone church and they made this cross all in a oneer, and at the same time they moved two other older crosses to kind of flank it on either side. So there's a lot of kind of planning going into this. So I think there is an argument there to say that this is possibly for church. I wanted to think about church consecration with some of the iconography that we're seeing on some of these crosses would be one possibility. But the other, and I think the most dominant role probably would be penance. We know that the crosses from some work that Anne Hamlin and John Higgett did, that there's plenty of evidence that they were used in a penitential context, possibly public penance. And we have good descriptions of those, of what penance involved, which would be sort of standing in the shape of a cross, so you're sort of echoing the shape of it, but also becoming fully prostrate at certain points as well. And I think that fits very nicely with thinking about the ground. The fact that as you were laying fully prostrate before the cross, you could possibly, depending how you timed it and whether the weather was with you, you could have a cross inscribed on your own body. The shadows of these crosses are quite dynamic and interactive. And in the article that I published on Clonmacnoise, I've argued, well, I know because I took a lot of time. It's slow looking. I took several years to see the cross during Advent. It actually, the length of the shadow extends far enough that it hits the wall of the church, and so that it would become upright during Advent, which I think is probably purposeful. We know that it replaced a wooden cross as well, so they'd be familiar with the interaction of these shadows, which are really, as you guys know, living in this hemisphere, the further north you go, the more extreme these long shadows become in the winter, and the more dynamic. I hope that answers.
That's a very nice idea, that idea of the shadow crossing. Of course, one can't be certain this happened. I've just been looking at some evidence for the use of this term, pingo crucium, to paint yourself when you cross yourself. Yeah. You paint yourself. Right. That goes back to Alcuin, and they're still using it in the late Middle Ages. So the idea that you're painted with the shadow of the cross. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Down the back.
Hi. Thank you so much for your paper, and I think you've actually just answered my question. I was going to ask about the role of shadows in the landscape and how the light affected it, because I really liked your comment about Mary being the tabernacle set in the sun, and when it's outside, she's set in the sun itself. But you sort of already answered it, but just thank you for such a fabulous paper.
Oh, thank you. I would add that she becomes completely overshadowed when the sun is rising behind her. So, you know, he is the tabernacle in the sun, but at the same time becomes overshadowed. And I don't think that's accidental when you think about Luke and the overshadowing of the Virgin, perhaps.
Lindy.
Thank you very much. Such rich iconography, very, very fascinating. This is a question from complete ignorance about these sites, but your discussion of the bodies beneath the cross and things made me, and to some extent, the sort of spatial arrangement made me think of late medieval, particularly Breton, I suppose arrangements where cemeteries which usually have a cross, but where also you have an ossuary, and where they're digging up the continually digging up those who are buried there and putting them in the ossuary, or Saint-Maclou at Rouen, or indeed the Innocents at Paris. So this whole idea of the cross in the center of sort of delimited space where people are buried, but then continually being brought up from burial as you put more in, and then, you know, you had that wonderful image of the beast digging up the leg, and putting the remains into ossuaries. And I just wondered if there's any evidence for that sort of thing happening at this early stage.
Thanks. Yeah, there is. With Clonmacnoise, we know, for example, the oldest cross, what we think is probably the oldest, second oldest, that flanks this one that's so prominent, has actually got, they moved two bodies. So we know that they're 7th or 8th century bodies that were reinterred directly under the base. So it was only, this is actually a cast, I should say. So they pulled these out of the ground, I think in the early 90s, and did a lot of excavation when they did. And when they pulled it out of the ground, they found these two bodies placed. And there was also other evidence in the excavation reports of a lot of shuffling around of bodies. So yeah, I think you're right, though. I mean, we can't trust that antiquarian drawing of Iona, but it certainly makes it look like everyone was trying to get in close. And when I spoke to Adrian Maldonado, he said, he described it as a multi-story car park. He said that, you know, there were so many bodies between those crosses and Columbus Shrine. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, now Martin Hennig had a question, but Richard Plant has also got one. So Richard Plant.
I have a question from Megan McNamee, who thanks you for such a stimulating paper and is struck by the very active engagement with the ground, digging, plunging, etc., represented. Do you think your argument has implications for how we understand monastic working of and engagement with the land, agricultural activities, and so on?
Okay. Speaking of, I know Megan's in California, and just to tell her, her plants are still alive, so in her office. But speaking of agriculture, yeah, I do, and I've argued in the longer chapter from which this has come, that I think that actually plays a vital role as well in their understanding of these monuments and their understanding of the ground, which is so. When we put people in the ground or things in the ground, we walk away and it becomes a surface. It's so different from when you're constantly digging. And I mean, I'm sure some people have gardens, unlike me, but you know, it is a different thing. And I think this idea of processes happening underground, invisible processes happening underground, I think it makes you much more aware than a city slicker living in a third floor flat like myself. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Megan and Martin.
shadows and the sun, and think of these crosses. Before, there were rather grand buildings behind them, and so that they're fairly early. I mean, before then, perhaps we're thinking of before Christianity. And what I'm struck with is the way that prehistorians also talk about monuments, playing with the dead and things like that, all the work that Richard Bradley has done. And you've got people converted to Christianity, but still holding on to some of these ideas. And I wonder whether there isn't a prehistory here to be in connection with perhaps looking as well for earlier monuments on the site where things may have been going on even before full conversion, and even after that, a connection of sort of folkloristic elements that are tied in with much more sophisticated elements which come from the Psalms. And this strikes me as it's something that's sometimes struck me when I've visited these sites, not only there, but at our Carlisle conference, we visited Bewcastle, in which there's a cross in the centre of what the military archaeologists call a fort, but it's not. It's Farnham Cockedy. It's a very powerful temple site. And there, as it were, what was there before, and the ways that this may well, perhaps at some of these other sites, tie in with earlier things going on. So when seeing not just things that are highly sophisticated and belong to a full Christian understanding of these texts, but also something else which people would look on, which comes actually from the ground, from people who were there, who were used to some of these elements going on in a pre-Christian context.
Thank you. I'm hoping there's so much archaeology with the Pictish stones going on right now, and they're discovering so much. And certainly there's evidence, I know the Pictish evidence better, that of the reuse of stones, and even the protecting of previous pre-Christian carvings, and the grouping around them. That I think it's certainly possible, and it's really going to take more archaeology and excavation. The problem always is with a lot of these places, as I'm sure everyone knows, is the fact that a lot of them are in active, cemeteries. I mean, monastic boys, you're not going to be able to, and nor should you. But it does mean that we have a very partial picture. But yeah, thank you. I think so. I do. I'm just very nervous about making that connection, but yeah.
Any more questions? Yes, there's one. No, Stephen.
Thank you, Heather. That was wonderful. How wonderful to see all those amazingly beautiful objects. Bede said that Aidan's first church at Lindisfarne was built after the Irish fashion, that is to say, built of wood. And so far as I know, most of the surviving Irish stone churches are from relatively late and are predated by a number of the high crosses. Is it reasonable to think that a lot of churches in early Christian Ireland would have been of timber? It seems to me that we are lacking a great deal of the context of the high crosses, timber churches, and also carved ornament on timber halls. Is it reasonable to think then that there may have been wooden high crosses before there were stone ones? And if there were, if the crosses were made of the material of Christ's cross, lignum crucis, that would rather change the way they were seen in relation to the ground, of course. But I don't know if there's any reason for thinking that the stone high crosses were a rendering in a more permanent form of an art form which could also have existed, maybe did exist, also in wood.
Thank you. I think there certainly is evidence, and people have written about it in terms of how, especially looking at Iona, the reason that we think it's the first intentional ringed cross, because the other one on Iona, the ring was put in when the cross collapsed, so it was a kind of experimental method of construction, which is what makes everyone think that St. Martin's cross is the first one where they intended to put that ring. But the way that the crosses on Iona are constructed suggests, and I'm trying to remember who talks about this, I think possibly Ian Fisher, that they were using carpentry, wood techniques in stone. So there's definitely this. And the really exciting thing that they found so much when they pulled these crosses out of the earth at Clonmacnoise was that they also found evidence of what they believe was a wooden cross, exactly where that one was. I think it's that one, that there was a trace of a wooden cross underneath. So these are replacement. And I really do think Clonmacnoise also is very into its own materiality. There's lots of references to stone, Monasterbois as well. I think they're very aware that they're making stone and that it feels like a real shift for them. So I think they would certainly have the same attitude probably to wood. I think they would sense that connection, and certainly other medieval artists made a lot of the connection of wood with the wood of the cross. So thanks.
Anybody else? Any more questions? Okay, well, if there are no more, then we'll thank you again very much indeed. It's my duty to remind, this doesn't need to be recorded so I can shout, to remind people that a number of the more bibulous members of the association repair to the pub afterwards, and that anybody who would like to come along should just keep an eye on the door and see when people are heading